Hey everyone, how's it going? I have yet another discussion video, but this time not maybe Midrash related. And this discussion video is about this idea that's been percolating in my mind, and it's this idea of top-down versus bottom-up readers. And this relates to a couple of terms that come from psychology. They're particularly important, I think, in cognitive psychology, although they do permeate other areas of psychology. But in psychology, there's this idea of top-down versus bottom-up processing. So in bottom-up processing, you sort of start with individual pieces of a puzzle, individual perceptions, and sort of build your idea of what something means from those individual pieces of your perceptions or pieces of data or information. Whereas top-down processing tends to involve just taking an overall picture of what something is. The easiest example probably would be when you see a series of dots that are arranged in a shape. Like let's just say at the simplest level that a bunch of dots are arranged in the form of a triangle, and you don't look at each individual dot to figure out that it's a triangle. You just see the triangle. And those are crude definitions. I haven't learned about this sort of thing for a long time, but there's this idea of top-down versus bottom-up processing in psychology, and it struck me the other day that it's possible that readers can be roughly divided between bottom-up and top-down readers. And I don't mean divided as in it's a dichotomy, like you're either one or the other. I think that it's probably more of a spectrum, right? Like the political spectrum. You can fall anywhere along the path from right to left, right? And same thing with being a top-down versus a bottom-up reader. You can fall anywhere along the spectrum. And I imagine there are some people who are in the middle. But I'll talk about what I think I mean by this. So I'll talk about bottom-up and top-down readers sort of in their most pure extreme forms. So a bottom-up reader would, I think, be someone who starts with individual words within individual sentences that are a part of individual paragraphs that are part of individual pages of individual chapters of a book. And they will sort of work from the word to find the meaning of the sentence, to find the meaning of the paragraph, to find the meaning of the page, to find the meaning of the chapter, to find the meaning of the book. So they sort of start inwards with the smallest unit and work outwards. And they want to understand what's going on in a book as they go along. They really want to dissect it as they go along and understand completely what's going on, to the extent that you can understand any book completely when you read it, especially if it's like a complex work of fiction. But so they really want to understand everything completely. So I think people who are bottom-up readers tend to be sub-vocalizers, so they speak the words sort of in their head as they read. They tend to be very slow readers, I think. They tend to reread passages, I think. They reread sentences, paragraphs. Perhaps they ponder them a little bit before they move on, and so on and so forth. And they might even take notes or something in their most extreme form. But there are people who really move at a glacial pace through their reading. They're a little bit like those ships that have to break through ice as they sail. And then on the other end, we have top-down readers who probably read much more quickly, probably don't sub-vocalize. They don't necessarily skim, I don't think. Maybe some of them do, but I'm not saying that they necessarily skim. But they read very quickly, they don't sub-vocalize. They're looking for big picture stuff, just what's the gist of what's going on in this chapter, on this page, in this sentence. What's the broad meaning of what's happening here? And they might rely a lot more on rereads to really flesh out their comprehension. Whereas I think the people who are bottom-up readers, probably part of the motivation for being a bottom-up reader is that you want to, have the measure of something on one read. And that's probably particularly important for bottom-up readers because, again, they're quite slow. So it'll be hard for them to make time to reread a book in order to form their opinion. Whereas top-down readers, again, tend to be faster readers. So rereading something to get a deeper understanding of it isn't such a big deal for them. And so I'd be curious. I'm just sort of making this video to sort of ask a question more than divide people in any which way. I definitely fall, I think, on the bottom-up end of the spectrum. I sub-vocalize, I read very slowly, I underline, I annotate, I reread passages, I do occasionally take notes. I'm trying to get better about taking notes to try to like increase my memory and comprehension of stuff. I'm definitely towards the bottom up end of the spectrum. And when I say this, I don't mean that either method is any better than the other. I think I think probably it would be easier for a top-down reader to read more widely because they read more quickly, they can read more things, whereas a bottom-up reader probably needs to be a lot more selective in what they read. And that's certainly what I find, when I talk to people who read really, really fast. I'm often really jealous of how widely they get to read, and I'm such a slow reader that I have to kind of really pick and choose between what I actually pick up and what I put to the side. And so top-down readers, they're not deep readers. It again is not what I mean, but they're less focused on dissecting books and more interested in big picture stuff, and they let rereads kind of deepen their knowledge. Whereas, again, I think that bottom-up readers really want the gist of the sense of a book on a first read, and we'll reread books and we'll still get more out of them on a second read. So I'd be curious to know whether you think this is a valid spectrum, whether you think that you are a top-down or a bottom-up reader, like whether you think that maybe what kind of reader you are shifts on what kind of book you're reading. There are books that I read faster than other books. I tend to read, for example, nonfiction much faster than fiction. It's funny to me that so many people are intimidated by nonfiction, because actually I find nonfiction much, much easier than fiction. Because I think fiction takes a lot more dissection to get the measure of. If it's good fiction. If it's bad fiction, then I don't really care. But, and so I read nonfiction a lot faster than fiction. I can do some suppression of my sub-vocalizing when I'm reading nonfiction. And then there are certain kinds of fiction as well, like maybe children's fiction is easier to read for me to read in a top-down way, especially since I think children's fiction does tend to be a bit less complicated. Not to be condescending, but I think it does tend to be just easier reading on a prose level than perhaps literary fiction or genre fiction or forms of adult genre fiction. Genre fiction, I don't read that much genre fiction, but I don't actually necessarily find that I read it faster than literary fiction or classics. So there's that as well. And then there's poetry, and for me, I can't read poetry in any other way than a bottom-up way. It's just, I don't think that I would ever get anything out of poetry if I didn't read it in a bottom-up way. I don't think I could not sub-vocalize to read a poem, because part of what makes poetry is the music of it, right? So I have to sort of at least hear it in my head, even if I'm not reading it aloud. But then there's plays as well, and plays, again, because they're supposed to be a work of drama, it's hard for me not to sub-vocalize what people are saying in them. I'd be curious to hear your guys' thoughts on all of this. Again, where you fall, what kinds of books you tend to read in what ways, or just general thoughts on the whole distinction. But that's really all. So I hope you enjoyed. I will leave it at that and talk to you all later. Bye.